Well, let's talk about an ideal situation to understand how digestion works.
Yeah.
So somebody is sitting down to a ribeye steak. They take that first bite. Let's walk through ideally what happens in the body.
Yeah. So the first thing to understand about that ribeye steak is it is the most nutrient dense food that humans can eat. And what I mean by that is, if you want to look at this on a per calorie basis or per gram basis, right? The nutrients that are in that meat are really optimized for humans. And the other thing to understand about that meat is it's also the most bioavailable food to us as human beings. Over millions of years of evolution, for the vast majority of which we were primarily carnivores, meaning that meat was the majority of our diet, and our digestive systems evolved to be able to extract those nutrients from the meat. And we do not have the same reaction to plant products. The bioavailability of the nutrients that are in plant products are very poor. We're not optimized for that. So that's that's the reason that I advocate meat as the primary part of our diet. That's the reason I now tell people that meat is medicine. But so when things are working well, the meat goes in your mouth. Um, it starts to get broken down, right? And this actually, most people don't realize this starts in the mouth. We have enzymes and we have microbes, right, within our mouth that start to break down that food. And then it continues, it goes down through the what we call the esophagus, the food pipe, and then it gets into your stomach where things really accelerate, very highly acidic environment. And it's supposed to be a highly acidic environment. One of the most common reasons that we see people today having gut problems is because they've been put on, medications to reduce the acidity of their stomach. They might have had something like reflux, gastroesophageal reflux disease, and they were told that the solution to that problem is reduce the acid in the stomach. That's not how it's supposed to work. We were designed to have very acidic stomachs because that's going to help break down that meat and help break it down into its components, the nutrients, the amino acids, right, and the proteins, all of that, that are now going to make it easier for us to extract those nutrients. And then as it goes through the digestive system, without getting, too deep in the weeds here, right, we start to extract the nutrients that we need. We start to we get those proteins, those amino acids, we get the fats, right? Another thing that's very unique about animal fats is that it carries a lot of the important nutrients. We have what are called fat soluble nutrients, fat soluble vitamins that need to be in fat for our body to be able to access them. And that's why meat, and really meat alone, is what we are optimized to eat.
Okay, let's take this a little bit further. Once these nutrients get absorbed, they're in the bloodstream. Any other potential hangups on the way to the cell or within the cell?
Yeah, so one other thing I think would be good for us to bring into the conversation at this point is even before that, on the absorption part of it, uh, there are what are called anti-nutrients. And anti-nutrients are things that are in plants primarily that might block the absorption of those nutrients. So, when you eat your meat alone, you're not going to get any anti-nutrients. When people are eating meats with vegetables, right, which people think that's a healthy way to do, have your meat, have your vegetables. And I'm not necessarily saying it isn't, but understand that some of those plants, some of those vegetables have what are called anti-nutrients, so that when they're in your digestive system together, that might actually reduce how much you're able to get out of the meat. And this is one of the problems that we see with eating things from the plant kingdom. Now, those same chemicals, these anti-nutrients, as they're absorbed into our system, they might be causing problems, elsewhere, peripherally, we can say, outside of the digestive system, but their primary issue is going to be within the digestive system. Now, once the nutrients are in your bloodstream and they're going around, yes, there can be issues with how we're able to use those. I think one of the common ones that we end up seeing, people may have heard about this, is what are called methylation issues, right? So, methylation is a way that our body, uh, some of these vitamins, for instance, the B vitamins in particular, right? They come into the system and they are in a form that is inactive. We can't use them in the cells and they need to be activated. And one of the ways we do this is what's called methylation, which is a chemical process that modifies those vitamins. So now our cells can use them. And some people, many people actually, have genetic variants that they're not good methylators. They don't do that process well. When people become insulin resistant, when people develop inflammation, that might even worsen. They methylate even worse. And therefore, they might be getting those B vitamins, but they're not getting the end effects that they need from them. And we might need to do something to help their methylation processes. That's one example of getting the nutrients in might not be enough. We then need to be able to utilize them and leverage them properly.
For that person that is having difficulty with methylation, what would that look like other than reversing the insulin resistance you talked about?
Yeah, so the first thing you want to do is things like reverse the insulin resistance, reverse the inflammation. But if that patient has a truly genetic block, right, that might not be enough. And a workaround in this case is you might need to supplement with the B vitamins in an already methylated form. And therefore, you're kind of bypassing the need for your body to do that methylation step.
For somebody that is unsure whether or not they're in that camp regarding methylation, is the methylated B vitamin safe for everybody?
Yeah, I think it generally is safe for everybody. Now, you can test your methylation, right? You can do genetic testing and get a sense of how well you're going to be able to methylate. More so, what we do is we look at one of the sort of byproducts of methylation. So, there is a blood test called homocysteine. This is one of those blood tests that kind of flies under the radar. Most doctors don't really know about it, they don't include it in the standard testing. What's interesting about homocysteine is when it is elevated, we know that associates with increased risk of many things, but primarily of interest to me is your risk of heart disease, your risk of high blood pressure, your risk of stroke go up when your homocysteine is elevated. Um, Homocysteine becomes elevated when we don't methylate well. And again, we'll try to not get too deep in the weeds, but homocysteine is an amino acid. It's in our bloodstream. It's not supposed to accumulate in our bloodstream. Homocysteine is supposed to get converted to other things, including another amino acid called methionine. It also gets converted to some of the neurotransmitters that we use in our brain. It's a very interesting molecule, amino acid. Um, in order to do that conversion of homocysteine to these other things, the methylated B vitamins are what we call a cofactor. It's necessary to have enough methylated B vitamins around so that we can be converting to homocysteine. And so when you don't have enough methylated B vitamins, the homocysteine starts to accumulate. So this is an easy blood test that people can do. And it gives us an idea about how well they're methylating. You can also directly test genetically, test the genes that code for a lot of the enzymes that help with methylation. There's one called, the one that we talk about most is what's called the MTFHR mutation. There's a couple of others. One is called COMT, COMT. These things can all be tested genetically, but usually the first step for me, for my patients, is we look at that homocysteine level. And if the homocysteine level is high, besides looking at things like inflammation and insulin resistance, we're going to start the patient on methylated B vitamins. And the vast majority of the time, that resolves the problem.
You brought up plant toxins. We'll get back to those shortly.
Yep.
But coming back to our ribeye steak example, I'm just trying to make sure I understand the different areas within that digestion, absorption, where issues can arise. The one that jumped out to me, you mentioned the stomach acid. I assume if people aren't producing enough, taking enzymes, taking HCl can help with that.
Yep.
But let's talk more to that piece and then others along the chain before we get to plants that can disrupt our body getting the nutrients.
Yeah, so besides the low acid problem, right, which is going to make if the stomach is less acidic, we're not going to break down, the meat or whatever we're eating as well, and that's going to then make it harder, right? Because the next step after it starts to get broken down is it now needs to get absorbed by our body, right? So keep in mind our gastrointestinal tract, right? Our digestive system. It is sort of, it is technically outside of our bodies, right? There is a lining, there is a barrier there, right? That guards against things that we don't want getting into our bloodstream. And regulates what can get into our bloodstream. And this is an active process, right? People sometimes get the misconception, right, that as long as the food is sort of sitting there, right, it's going to get into our bloodstream. But it turns out it is a very tightly regulated, very active process of what gets across that barrier and ultimately into our bloodstream and what passes through, right, and gets disposed of as waste ultimately in our stool. When that lining starts to get disrupted, that absorption, the regulation of that absorption becomes a problem. And this is what we call leaky gut. We start to get, so the makeup of the wall of the intestines has these things, it's called tight junctions. The cells essentially are very tight against each other, and that is what blocks things from just passively moving through. When we get leaky gut, essentially those cells start to spread out. So now they're not as tightly opposed, and now we have a problem of some things that aren't supposed to get through start to get through, and the things that we are supposed to bring through actively aren't, properly bought through because there's dysregulation of this whole system. And so leaky gut, along with low acid, becomes another big problem that people get that is going to alter their ability to absorb the nutrients that we ultimately are looking for from our food.
I mentioned the enzymes, HCl. I know there's digestive bitters. Anything else in that realm for people that need help?
Yeah, so there are a lot of supplements ultimately that can help target this. There are all sorts of digestive enzymes outside of just the hydrochloric acid, and there are things like bile salts, for instance, that may be helpful for people that are having trouble absorbing fat in particular. Maybe you had your gallbladder taken out, right? And your bile system isn't quite optimized. But again, before we get to that stuff, right, we always want to go back to the root cause. And we want to say, why is your gut inflamed? Why do you have this leaky gut? And what can we do about that? Right. And the primary cause of leaky gut is going to be, again, the highly processed foods, the sugars, the highly refined carbohydrates, the vegetable and the seed oils, right, that are, lead to uh, inflammation within the intestines itself and dysfunction of those cells, right, that are designed to be actively bringing the nutrients across. These things are all impeded by processed foods, is really the big category I put in. And then in some people, things like plants, right, and those anti-nutrients, part of why they are part of how they work, um, is by damaging, again, the intestinal lining and causing things like leaky gut. So that's why we have to have caution about some of those things. Ultimately, uh, when you really start to talk to people who are just eating kind of a standard Western diet, almost all of them have some level of gut dysfunction. They may not recognize it as such, but when you start to really uh, think about how common it is for people to say, "Well, after I eat, I get bloated, I get gassy, right? I get, my stomach gets distended." That is all, evidence of indicators of gut dysfunction, and it's just kind of accepted as normal within our society anymore. But it's not, it shouldn't be, and it's an alert that your body isn't working as it should be.
When it comes to leaky gut specifically, you just named a bunch of symptoms. Is that the best way to get insight whether or not we have that? And then you named a bunch of different insults, including processed foods. Is removing those enough to let that heal? Or do you recommend certain supplements or certain protocols?
Yeah, so I do believe that the symptoms are really the best way to get about this. There are some different tests that can be done. None of them really have, I think, proven themselves to do better than just asking about the symptoms, in my practice. Ultimately, there are some situations where we might do the testing, but in general, it really starts with the symptoms, for me. Um, the What to do about it, removing processed food is always the first step in my mind. Again, I always try and look at things like what can we do from a root cause approach before we start relying on things like supplements and pharmaceutical agents. Those may play a role. There are certainly situations where people have very severe gut dysfunction, and things like that might be necessary. You might need to go through a protocol, for instance, that is rebalancing the microbiome, right? Which is another aspect of this that we haven't gotten to yet, but I'm sure we'll touch on. And, that might involve some supplements. It might even involve some pharmaceutical agents. So those things can become part of the protocols, but the first step is always, if it's the food that primarily caused this damage in the first place, let's remove as much of the damaging food as possible, and give the body a chance to heal. Our bodies are miraculous in their capability to heal from lots of different things. But the first thing you need to do if you want your body to heal is you need to stop injuring it, right? And if on a daily basis you keep putting in these damaging substances, the processed foods, your body isn't going to have that ability to heal. And so that really is the first step for me always.
Coming back to the beginning of digestion, you mentioned it starts in the mouth, which before reading your new book, I always knew about amylase and the digestion starting there with starches, but there's also fat digestion that begins in the mouth too.
Yeah, again, our mouths are amazing, and everything that's going on there between like I mentioned, the oral microbiome, the bacteria that are in our mouth, that start some of this breakdown process, that start to produce chemicals like nitric oxide, which does so many amazing things within our body, and having the right balance of the right bacteria is important. So, one of the things that has become pervasive in our society that I don't think is beneficial are these mouthwashes, especially the ones that are, heavily alcohol based and other chemicals, right? And they're designed The concept is, well, we don't want bacteria in our mouth, right? Let's try and kill as much of it as possible. But that's the wrong approach. There are bacteria that when they become, overgrown within our mouth, they're certainly harmful and they might contribute to things like cavity formation. But you don't want to go, wiping out the whole area, right? You don't want to like start, bringing out the napalm essentially, right, to your mouth. You want to eat the right foods that are going to feed the right bacteria so that you can have that good balance of bacteria in your mouth and they're going to start the digestive system properly. We then have glands, right, within our mouth, the salivary glands and others, right, that are going to be secreting some of the things like amylase that you mentioned, lipase, right, which is one that helps to start to break down the fat. And this is very important as well. And again, it is a finely tuned system, right? If you're not damaging it, it works great. But the problem is we start damaging it, right? We start damaging it with things like sugar. We start damaging it with the processed foods. We might unintentionally be damaging it when we use things like mouthwash, even certain types of toothpaste, right, that are going to, disrupt things there. Those can all be contributors. And then if you have something like periodontal disease that has now formed, right, that's going to magnify and amplify those problems. So oral health becomes a very important component of metabolic health. Now, what is especially interesting to me about this is, early on in my career as a heart surgeon, right, and during my training, I learned that there was a link between oral health and heart health, right? We know, for instance, that people that have periodontal disease, they have breakdown, of the gums. Oftentimes that's associated with having cavities and things like that. Those people are at higher risk of having heart disease. We also know that when you look at the plaque that forms in the arteries of our heart, you can see bacteria in there that live in our mouth, right? And, so conceptually, what's happening there is the bacteria from the mouth are getting into the bloodstream. They're causing the inflammation in the blood vessels, or they're contributing to it. And then they get trapped within the plaque that is a response, basically, to try and heal that inflammation. So I've always known that there's this, mouth gut connection. But I didn't realize quite how strong it was, right, until I started learning about things like metabolic health and learning about the oral microbiome and how it really influences things on many levels.
Since you made it to the end of this clip, I know you're going to love the full episode. Click here to watch. I'll see you over there.
Early on in my career as a heart surgeon, I learned there was a link between oral health and heart health. People that have periodontal disease, those people are at higher risk of having heart